Now let's talk about one of the most primary things that you should take into consideration when you formulate your research, and that is to research upon the member nation that you represent. Now the first thing that will obviously come to your mind when we talk about giving a good thought about researching on the member nation that you represent is that ideally, why is it even important for us to research about the country that we'll represent? Now first and foremost, in order for you to come out to a very eccentric solution based approach to the best of your ability knowledge, ideally it's very important for you to know what you represent, what country do you represent, its geopolitical scenario, right, what your country's contribution is to the agenda in hand, and at the end of the day what your country's future prospective role is towards the crisis that we are all taking under consideration. So this is what is eccentric to your research about the member nation that you represent. First and foremost, it's ideal that, considering the fact that in a model UN house you don't represent yourself in your own personal capacity, but you represent the interests and the belief of the member nation, it's eccentric to your own personal representation skills and the representation skills upon which you may or may not be judged upon. Second of all, you are representing a state and its people, and yes, therefore it becomes your primary responsibility to express the views of your people in the most precise manner. And that is where the true essence of a diplomat comes into picture. You need to know your state well before you can actually come out with the decision making pertaining to anything that can have a greater influence over your fellow member nations or the member nations that are an eccentric part to that agenda that has been taken under consideration. Now, what to learn about the member nation that you represent? There are some basic postulates or there are some basic indicators that you always need to keep in mind when you talk about your member nation on a very comprehensive note inside the model UN house, or when you formulate your research around the member nation that you represent. You need to know the political system of your member nation, whether your member nation is a democracy, whether it's a constitutional monarchy, right, whether it's a dictatorship, whether it's a necrocracy just like the North Korea. You need to know the entire political system of the member nation that you represent. You need to know the current economic status, whether it's a developed country, developing country, it's a third world country, right, as many international experts term it as, whether it's going under a severe economic crisis if you are dealing with an agenda that talks about economic crisis. You need to understand the geographic indicators. You need to understand the current geographic demographics of the member nation that you represent. What is the influence of your member nation around the geopolitical scenario that you are living in? What is the cultural aspects of the agenda that of the member nation that you represent? And there are a significant number of other similar indicators that can truly help you and guide when it comes to formulating your research upon the member nation that you represent. There is one more thing that has been very highly anticipated in the MUN culture, and that is to basically know and understand the foreign policy of the member nation that you represent. Now, let me make you very clear and let me make you understand the very concept of foreign policy, because we personally believe that this particular concept of foreign policy is something that has been heavily misunderstood. Foreign policy in very layman term means that what is the relation of the member nation you represent with the other member nations around you. For example, if I have to talk about what is the foreign policy of India, it simply means India's relation with its neighbors and India's relations with the other member nations inside the UN. There is, there are some things that a lot of people might tell you about the foreign policy, and that is that a foreign policy is never subject to violation, and this particular statement is absolutely incorrect. Now, when we say that the foreign policy is your member nation's relation with the other member nations, it's subject to change. Now, it could change as a result of any decision making that you and the other member nations came out with. It could be a result of the ongoing crisis. It could be a result of anything that can hamper or even turn relations from bad to worse. So at the end of the day, we have to always accept the fact that first, if two member nations initially have had tense relations in the past, it's not compulsory for them to continue those tense relations in the future. And that is where the true essence of foreign policy comes into picture. which means that a foreign policy may change with time. For example, let's consider a very hypothetical scenario where United States of America and Russia are enemies. First of all, US and Russia are not enemies. They have had tense relations in the past. And considering the fact that they've had tense relations in the past, their tense relations should never compel them to continue with those tense relations in the future. They always have this leverage of making sure that they better their relations, when it comes to discussing economics, when it comes to discussing their individual geopolitical influences that they've had in the Cold War era and in the coming course of time. So at the end of the day, just because they've had bad relations in the future, they shouldn't be compelled to continue with those bad relations in the future. And that is where the true essence of the foreign policy comes into picture. Foreign policy is something which is subject to the changing times. In the changing times, two good neighbors may become bad neighbors, and two bad neighbors may become good in the future. So this is what we mean when we say that you shouldn't be very authoritative about the foreign policy that your member nation has adhered to in the past, because at the end of the day, keeping into consideration the discussions that you will have, the deliberations that you will have, your foreign policy or your relations with the other member nations might change. Again, what to learn about the member nation that you represent? You need to know what regional blocks it is a part of, right? If there are some neighboring free trade agreements that your member nations has been a part of recently, right? Or some regional blocks that promote regional cooperation, political stability and finance. You need to know about all this, because this will really help you develop a perception about the agenda that you will be taking under consideration. So when you get to know about the regional blocks that your member nation is a part of, you get to know what is its primary intention, what its primary situation in the current geopolitical scenario, and at the end of the day, what might suit best to the interests of your member nation. One more thing which is very, very important for you to know is the constitution of your member nation, if it has any, and at the end of the day, all the other domestic laws that your country has and that are in complete correlation to the agenda that has been taken under consideration inside the UN. Now, there could be a situation where the agenda, not the agenda, but the decision that the UN body came out with respect to the crisis in hand, it might not be in compliance to the domestic law that your country has with respect to that situation. So you need to keep a good balance between the domestic laws that you always have to adhere to, because at the end of the day, they are domestic laws. And you have to keep an equal balance with the decision making that you came out inside the UN body. So it should be a balance between your domestic laws and the decisions that you took in consensus with the other member nations. Again, you should pay very, very precise attention to the basic principles and values that your nation stands for. It might be codified in the form of the laws that your member nation has, or it may not be codified. Why? Because it is a part of the customary or humanitarian law which doesn't need to be codified. Now, talking about some other research intermediaries that you can always encounter, there are a lot of other UN bodies that might help you with the research. It may be a part of the UN family, it may or may not be a part of the UN structure, right? For example, there are a lot of independent organizations like the World Trade Organization, which work in correlation with the United Nations, but at the end of the day, they are not a part of the United Nations. They are a part of the UN family. Why? Because the UN is in a complete coordination with these independent organizations. But at the end of the day, since they are not a part of the UN, but still, considering the fact that they have always worked with a complete correlation with the UN, you can even refer the documentation of these other intermediaries so as to better your research in the first place. You need to have a good understanding about the mandate of the committee, and this is something that we've already discussed. Most importantly, you need to even have a good understanding about the past UN actions which the United Nations has taken in relevance to the crisis in hand. Because at the end of the day, first of all, if it's a prolonged crisis or an ongoing crisis, the UN itself might have taken some initial steps so as to make sure that it could better the situation. So, being the representative of the member nation inside the UN, it becomes our primary responsibility to first know that what UN in totality has taken steps so as to make sure that it could, if not eradicate the complete issue, but lessen the magnitude of that issues. And at the end of the day, what the UN has previously done so as to make sure that the situation in the current times is better.